And we are so excited to have Paul Higbee with us tonight, who is a longtime friend to the South Dakota State Historical Society and has done a lot of publishing with us and with South Dakota Magazine, for whom he is the correspondent in the Black Hills. And he's also the past president of the West River History Conference. And after 40 plus years in education, he's now retired and a full-time historian and writer. So you hopefully are familiar with a little bit with his book, First Strike, which he will be talking about tonight with us. First Strike, secondary title is Doolittle Raider Don Smith, who is a South Dakotan. And this is very timely because April 18th will be the 82nd anniversary of the Doolittle Raid. And Paul has also written for the South Dakota Historical Society Press a chapter in the 4th volume of our Plains Political Traditions series on Francis Case. So he's got a lot of different interests. Without further ado, I give you Paul Higbee and First Strike.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. Yeah, it was 5 years ago, 2019, that this book came out. And I really appreciated the Historical Society's help in making it possible, their guidance, people they introduced me to, and now putting together nice events like this to meet more of my readers. Vital sources for writing this book: Don Smith, and you'll learn all about him. Among his many qualities, he was a really good writer, and he especially wrote some of the most articulate military reports I've ever seen, as well as a long series of letters back home to his parents. I also spent a lot of time with the late Ruth Woodall, who was his cousin. And a great privilege for me was actually interviewing some of the surviving raiders themselves. They're all gone now, but especially David Thatcher, Ed Saylor, and Tom Griffin. The last raider died in 2019, just a few weeks before this book came out. That was Dick Cole. He was 103. He was not in enough, he wasn't healthy enough to do an interview with me, but I did get some information he wanted me to have relayed through his daughter. So great privilege to be able to talk to some of those surviving raiders late in their life. They all remembered Don. They all wanted to be a part of helping tell his story. And I've got to say, every one of them gave me something that I found in no other source. So very valuable interviews. This photo, one of the most famous in military history. I'm sure some of you recognize it. It is a B-25 taking off from the deck of the USS Hornet, a Navy ship, April 18th, 1942. By the numbers, there were 16 B-25s that took off that day and went on to bomb locations in Japan. This was just 4 months after Pearl Harbor. President Roosevelt thought it was imperative that the United States show that they were in this war. They weren't going to just be on the defense, they were going to go on the offense. So April, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Doolittle Raid was staged. It was named for the man who planned it and flew plane number 1, Jimmy Doolittle, who even then was already an aviation legend, who seemed like everybody knew his name. He had been a stunt pilot, an early military pilot in World War I. And I think in addition to planning the raid, one of the things that was most important that he did in World War II was working with Shell Oil Company, come up with a higher octane aviation fuel that gave American planes a lot more power. Another number, 2,602. That was a number everybody knew in Japan. 2,602 years, according to Japanese history, since any anybody off the home island of Japan had been able to attack it in any way. And it was quite a shock that after more than 2,000 years, Americans struck it in April of 42. And then, of course, as we all know about World War II, it was struck many, many, many times over the next 3.5 years, battered like few countries ever were before or since, including dropping 2 atomic bombs. Another number significant to that day, 300 feet. The Raiders had at maximum 500 feet to get off the deck of the Hornet. Don Smith did it in 297 feet. And as you'll learn later, I had no opportunity to interview Don Smith. He was dead before I was born, but I've read enough of his writing to know that hitting that 297 feet, 3 short of 300 feet, would have meant 2 things for him. As a football player, it was less than the length of a football field. As a baseball fan, he would have known that was less than a home run to right field in Yankee Stadium. And they had been, the Raiders had trained for 3 months doing what they called kangaroo takeoffs. In other words, going up as vertically as they could when taking off. And Don Smith was the best. Something else I always think about when I see this photo is Don's plane number 15, had a major engine problem on the way across the Pacific. And his mechanic was a young guy, just 20 years old, Ed Saylor, and there was nobody other than Ed Saylor qualified to fix, at age 20, a B-25 on the Hornet. And so he did the job all by himself. And I got to talk to Ed, and he said, yeah, we made the repair. We revved up the engine, but we had no way to do a test flight until we actually took off on April 18th. And Ed, like everybody who was part of the Doolittle Raid, he wondered if they'd possibly be able to get off the deck. In fact, he said, you know, detailed plans for the remainder of the raid, and some of us didn't really pay too much attention to those plans because we thought if we get off the plane, that's about all we can expect. There were some people, observers, who said they thought probably nobody would get off the deck of the plane. All of them watched Doolittle in plane number 1, and he made a good takeoff. And Ed Saylor and a couple other men said, you know, we knew if he had crashed into the sea, we would have tried, but we would had no expectation at all that we would get airborne. There had never been a flight like this in military circumstances. They had practiced these kangaroo flights, kangaroo takeoffs, but this was different. It was loaded with 5 men apiece and 4 bombs. And so the weight was entirely different. This is Don Smith, the subject of my book, and we'll learn his whole story in South Dakota. I should tell you, though, that he was not the only South Dakotan to fly the Doolittle Raid. Hank Potter, was Doolittle's navigator. If you try to look him up online now, and you put in Hank Potter or Henry Potter, it will redirect you, assuming that you actually want Harry Potter. But no, this was Hank Potter. He was from Pierre. He went to Yankton College. He survived the war and had a long career in the U.S. Air Force. Well, to tell you about Don Smith, he was born in January 1918. So he was 24 when he flew the raid. He was born at Oldham, South Dakota, kind of over by Brookings, DeSmet, that area. But his mother died young, and his father didn't think he could raise this son by himself. So he took Don's older brother named Charlie, and they just left. And Don ended up in an orphanage in Sioux Falls. Fortunately, about a week later, two of his cousins were training to be teachers in Sioux Falls, and they toured an orphanage as part of their training, and they recognized Don and called an uncle, and they came and brought him back to Oldham. But there was really nobody in the family who had room in their home to raise this boy. And they were thrilled when a veterinarian in the community, Dr. Arthur Smith, and his wife Laura said, we would like to raise him. We would like to adopt him. And so that's what happened. And within a year, the Smiths moved to Belle Fourche, the other side of the state. And for Don, Belle Fourche was the only home he ever really knew. And he loved Belle Fourche. His dad, being a livestock veterinarian, took him all the time on his rounds, working with animals. He was pretty sure by the time he was in high school, Don was, that that's what he wanted to do too, something in agriculture, especially something that was scientific in agriculture. He loved science, and veterinarian work was maybe something he thought he would like to get into. In Belle Fourche, he was very active in the Boy Scouts. I mentioned his love for baseball and football. That was a big part of his growing up. He loved a hill in Belle Fourche near his home, kind of on the north side of town, that was perfect for sledding. Talked all the time about sledding. And the biggest day of the year for him in Belle Fourche was the Black Hills Roundup rodeo. He just dropped everything and spent a full week helping out however he could with the rodeo every July, 4th of July week. He was an absolutely meticulous child and young man. Lots of people write letters home when they go off to college. Don did that religiously, but he made sure he found a typewriter so he could type those letters home. And that just is so much like him. Do it the best way you possibly can, the neatest way, the most organized way. Show you how South Dakota first knew Don Smith. That was as a center for the South Dakota State Jackrabbits. He had played football in high school in Belle Fourche. He played on the Roundup grounds. That's where football games were played for the high school. And as one of his classmates told me, we played in the dirt. And, after the 4th of July rodeo, most of the manure had dried up and became part of the dirt. So we played in dirt and manure in Belle Fourche. Quite a different experience over in Brookings. They had a nice field. He played on grass for the first time. And he had been frustrated as a football player in high school. He was small, but just before his sophomore year, he had a growth spurt. And as you can see, very muscular shoulders, muscular legs, very, very athletic young man. Now, I tell people that Don Smith was first known in South Dakota as a football player, which is true because in 1939, the Jackrabbits won a piece of the title, the conference title, and it was a big deal across South Dakota. Don Smith, as center, was named small school All-American. And so he was written up in papers all over the state. But I tell people that, and they think, okay, so he was a football player, and then he was a war hero. So he must have had this real, let's go get him sort of persona. And nothing could be farther from the truth. Don was a very quiet young man, very introspective, good writer, and he was a pacifist before the war. He desperately did not want to see the United States pulled into the war. But when war became a fact, and he knew he was a good pilot, I'll tell you how he got to that point. Absolutely, that's what he wanted to do, because he thought he had something he could contribute to the war. South Dakota State, he was known, of course, as a football player. He was also president of a club, the Poultry Club at South Dakota State. Poultry as in chickens. And that's what he was studying in the School of Agriculture at State. How do you produce chickens that gain good weight, produce lots of eggs? When I say he was interested in science, that was his favorite kind of science, agricultural science. And I think for 2 or 3 years, he was president of the South Dakota State Poultry Club. He was really fascinated by a system that was developed in Japan in the 1930s to determine the sex of chickens. And believe me, he would have preferred to go to Japan to study sexing of chickens than to fly a mission against it in the air. But he didn't get that opportunity. Okay. This is that 1939 South Dakota State football team that he was part of. And he was very proud of that. Followed South Dakota State during the war years and was always disappointed that they kind of fell off in the 40s. He went to Oxnard, California to learn to fly bombers in 1940. He signed up for the Army, and he was going to be a pilot if he could. He had had some experience flying small planes. He took flying lessons from the great Clyde Ice in Spearfish. And he said the most important thing he learned from Clyde Ice was Clyde's credo: you can't make a plane do what it can't do. You can't make a plane do what it can't do. In other words, Clyde Ice was saying, safety first. Know the limitations of your airplane. It was also in Spearfish with Clyde Ice that Don learned he never, ever got airsick, which was a great attribute for somebody trying to go into military flying. He watched many other young men wash out because they got airsick and couldn't handle the plane then. He did very well in his first station at Oxnard, California, was sent to San Antonio, Texas, and then he was introduced there to the biggest bombers. Biggest challenge, he said, keeping them level. The next big challenge, and for a while he wondered that if he could ever meet the challenge, was to fly in formation in very close proximity to other planes. From San Antonio, he went to Tacoma and Spokane, Washington. He didn't know what the project was up there, but they were experimenting with a new plane that had just rolled off the factory floors that spring of 1941. And that was the B-25 bomber, which he became an expert at. He flew actually some of the prototypes of the B-25. And the prototype needed some work. It sometimes had a problem when he was up in Spokane and Tacoma. Sometimes when it was ready to land, the landing gear didn't come down. And then they had to figure out what were they going to do, skid it in on its belly, or he always gave his crewmen, he was always flying with a crew of four, the chance to, if they preferred, he would skid it in on its belly, but they would be able to bail out and not endure the crash landing. However, he knew he never had to do that. He never had to do a crash landing. His landing gear, just by luck, he always said, always came down when it was time to land. Well, he gained a reputation as just a sterling B-25 pilot. And this was a big plane. It was 4 engines, very fast for that era. It was not an easy plane to fly, but he got it figured out. I think the only thing during those years that Don did that was impulsive was he met one Marie Crouch, and they had a whirlwind romance, and he married her just in a matter of weeks in Seattle, Washington. And he was so cautious, always know what your plane can do, always be safe. But this woman really swept him off his feet. And so they were married in June 1941 in Seattle. 6 months later, Marie was pregnant. So when Don flew the Doolittle Raid, he knew he was a father to be. He volunteered anyway, what a number of people thought was a suicide mission or the next thing to it. Fall of 1941, he was participating in mock warfare in the American Southeast. And some of those missions involved flying in on troops, ground troops, and dropping missiles on them, which were actually 1-pound bags of flour. And he was told, don't worry about hitting somebody with a 1-pound bag of flour. That can't hurt them. I don't know about that. A pound of flour coming out of the air from a little bit of a distance, I think it could hurt you. And Don was really, another way he was conscious, he was really careful where he dropped those bags of flour in mock warfare. He liked to hit a bridge and have it declared taken out rather than fellow soldiers. Well, he spent a couple months, late 1941, flying these mock wars. Then it was time to go back to Spokane, and he was flying home over Salt Lake, and he got a message over the radio that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. So this was, a couple weeks before Christmas. His immediate reaction was, well, it looks like our Christmas is shot to pieces. He was really looking forward to taking Marie back to Belle Fourche, tell his family that she was going to have a baby, and also ski or sled on his favorite hill in Belle Fourche. But of course, when he got back to the Northwest, all those plans were indeed shot to pieces, and he was on standby for the next month. Some of the things he did was patrol the Pacific coast, looking for submarines. And in fact, his group did find submarines, one submarine, and destroyed it. War was a fact. So it's about early to mid-February that he learned they needed some volunteers to fly a mission that it was described as dangerous as anything you will ever do. He didn't know what the mission was, but he knew as a capable pilot, if anybody could handle it, he could. So he signed up for what turned out to be the Doolittle Raid. He and a few other pilots and navigators went to South Carolina. That's where they met Jimmy Doolittle. They all recognized him by sight, and they knew if Doolittle was involved in this, it had to be something huge. Doolittle didn't tell them those first days what exactly they were going to do. He said that information would be released in stages. From South Carolina, they went to Florida, and they spent 3 weeks there. That's where they really practiced their kangaroo takeoffs. They sometimes pretended that the main part of Florida was their base, and they were going to fly west across the Gulf of Mexico and supposedly bomb Houston, Texas. They had targets in Houston that they came really close to. They did not drop bags of flour in Houston, but they would find their targets after flying across the Gulf of Mexico, turn around, and speed back to Pensacola, Florida. This was a prelude to what their actual mission was going to be. They understood, but they still didn't know what it was. Doolittle was stressing all the time, when you're flying over sea or over land in Houston, I want you to hug the deck. In other words, fly as close to the surface as you possibly can. Sometimes so close to the ocean that the plane was hit by ocean spray. That's really when some of the men got nervous, because they assumed flying a bomber, they were going to drop a bomb. And if you drop a bomb when you're hugging the deck, as they called it, the reverberation is going to tear your plane to pieces. It's often been said that none of the Doolittle Raider volunteers asked to be let out of the mission, although Doolittle told them they could at any point, no questions asked. In fact, one man did, and indeed, no questions were asked, and his name is not recorded by history. Don Smith apparently never considered dropping out. He was in for this mission. Finally, the end of March, it was time to move to fly planes across the country to San Francisco. There, they were going to load the planes on the Hornet, and it really wasn't until then that they found out what their mission was going to be. And without exception, they were excited about doing it. So they loaded up the planes, headed out of port, and one of the men, Tom Griffin, told me, he said, you know, there was no way, it was a top secret mission, but the planes in no way were hidden. There were not tarps over them. Anybody could see the Hornet was a carrier packed full of B-25s. He said, we sailed right under the Golden Gate Bridge, and it was a nice day, and there were people out walking and driving. Some of them had to wonder, what are these B-25s doing on a Navy carrier? And he said, of course, in our minds, we were pretty sure that every other person we saw up there was a Japanese spy. Because they were out in the open at sea, that's probably why Don's plane developed that engine problem that his engineer fixed. They were ready to go at mid-ocean. Doolittle wanted to get them within about 300 miles of the Japanese coast. And they spent their time studying maps. Everybody knew what exactly they were going to hit in Japan. Don learned that he was going to hit the southern Japanese town of Kobe. And he studied all the targets. He had 4 industrial targets. He studied those and came to feel like he could almost see Kobe in his head without a map. Well, they took off not 200 or 300 miles off the coast of Japan on April 18th, but they were more like 400 to 500 miles out, because they spotted a Japanese trawler and they believe that this boat probably reported this remarkable sight of seeing all these planes on a ship bound toward Japan. So Doolittle and the overall commander, General Hap Arnold, decided we're going to take off right away. First daylight of April 18th, which was a Saturday. And it was a terrible day, weather-wise. High waves, pounding rain. You couldn't have asked for a worse day to take off on any plane, let alone one on a moving ship deck. But they did it. And again, some people thought maybe none of these planes will get airborne, especially with this weather. In fact, they all did. Don was plane number 15, although they always called his plane not by number, but by a nickname that his man had come up with, which was TNT, explosive TNT. And again, their plane was the 15th to take off. So that meant they watched Doolittle take off, and they waited almost an hour before they were able to get off the deck. And they knew what that meant. When they got Doolittle was going to start bombing an hour before they arrived in Japan. They'd heard a lot about what capable anti-aircraft gunners the Japanese military was. So they assumed they were going to be met by a lot of guns when they hit Japan. That's what they were prepared for. And they had a long time to think about it. It was 7 hours after they took off until they hit the Japanese coast. Don's first problem in getting airborne was a Navy crew had forgotten to remove blocks under his wheels. So he revved up his engine and he wasn't moving. And first I wondered, well, was this part of that engine problem that we thought we had fixed? Now, some of the Navy realized right away that those blocks were there, asked him to pull back his throttle. They removed those blocks. And then the plan was for Smith and the other pilots to wait until the bow of the ship was moving upward, start moving, and then hopefully it was coming down right when you were ready to get airborne. And it worked perfectly for Don and most of the other pilots that day. They were all aware that so far really nothing was going according to plan. They had to take the early takeoff. That meant that not only were they going to hit Japan in broad daylight, but all of a sudden their fuel was really compromised. And all the navigators were calculating how far they were going to go, what the wind was like, and it really looked like they could get to Japan, but not beyond Japan to China, where the plan was for them to land. And so now what people said could be a suicide mission almost looked for certain that it was going to be a suicide mission, that they were going to crash into the East China Sea. Nonetheless, they did their mission. Don got to Kobe, Doolittle, and most of the other planes got to Houston. Every plane hit their targets except one that had a mechanical problem. Right away in Kobe, hugging the deck, flying low over the ocean, they hit the coast just a little bit east of Kobe. And Don would always say that the heaviest defense against them was a group of kids on the beach who threw rocks at them. There were no gunners to welcome them, and that was true of the other pilots too. So Don, in his head, with a map to back it up, flew north to south through Kobe, found all 4 of his industrial targets, and hit them. Later, there was Japanese propaganda that said Don deliberately struck a hospital. And he was a pretty level-headed guy who didn't get angry at much, but that infuriated him. He said, you know, there's no way we hit a hospital. We knew what these buildings were. He said, if that building we hit that they're referring to was a hospital, it was the first hospital ever that had airplanes coming out of it. He said it wasn't a hospital, it was a plane factory. About the time they pulled out of Kobe, there was a single gun that started firing at them. But they got out of the city without being hit. American gunners early in the war were criticized for not being very good. And so they had this in their mind that Japanese must be really good. Japanese gunners were no better than they were. Now they had to fly to China, and they were watching their fuel all the way. Every single plane, before it got to China, realized as it hit the coast, it was running on fumes. There was no way to get to the place where they were supposed to group and land. And as it turned out, talking about nothing going as planned, if they had gotten to this airfield, which was 100 miles inland, they would not have been ready for them. Doolittle thought he had a plan with the Chinese national government to help them land these planes and refuel. But there was nobody on duty. Some people think it was miscommunication. Some people think the Chinese national government had decided we can't help these Americans because it puts our people at too much risk. The Japanese already had soldiers stationed in China along the eastern seaboard. It's also thought, yeah, we can't help them, and we don't want to look like we're going to help them because what are the chances any of them are going to make it from Japan to China? Well, they all did, except one plane that flew north and landed in Russia, and that's a whole different story. But 15 of the planes made it to China. And it was decided in each plane that there are 2 things they could do. They could risk crash landing, or pilot could go up high and everybody could bail out. Not surprisingly, Don's crew, because they had such trust in his ability to do a crash landing, said, we're staying aboard. We're staying aboard. We're not jumping out into black night. And about half the other planes decided to bail out, including Doolittle's. But Don crash landed off the coast, about a mile off the coast. And everybody I talked to who was on that plane, Sailor, Griffin, said, you know, it was a perfect water landing. There was one flyer who was a little bit battered up, but not badly. They climbed out of the plane. They had about 3 or 4 minutes before the plane would sink. And then they discovered another thing. There they were, cold night, rainy night. They had a rubber raft that had been damaged at some point, and it was useless. So all they could do was swim a mile to shore on a stormy, rough sea. And they all made it. And then began the part of the book I really enjoyed writing the most, and that was their adventure walking out of China. They had to walk about 600 miles to get to the kind of backup place where they were to meet if they couldn't land at the airfield. They had no way to communicate with one another. There were some men that were severely hurt, and Don's plane was carrying the mission doctor, a guy named Thomas White. And so Don saw it as his mission. Yeah, start walking west across China. We know we have Japanese soldiers hunting us, so keeping out of sight as much as possible, but also as much as we can possibly do it, find the other crews so Doc White can render medical aid. And they were successful in meeting a number of those crews. They'd all come down in an area that was not too far apart. And there were Chinese people who said, hey, a plane like this came down over here and over here. Tom Griffin told me, he said, that sounds good and fine. But he said, I'm ashamed to admit this, but and we knew we had Japanese soldiers hunting us. Chinese people probably have a mind to help us, although we didn't know for sure, because the Chinese national government was in a conflict with the Chinese Communist Party. And there were also just a lot of guerrillas out there that were free agents looking for anybody to rob. In fact, right where Don Smith landed in the ocean, they were having a terrible time that spring with pirates who came in and were affiliated with nobody. And so the people who first saw his men assumed these are probably some pirates. But what Tom Griffin said was, I'm sorry to admit this, but I didn't know the difference visually between a Chinese person or a Japanese person. I sure didn't know either language. So that to begin with, beyond that, couldn't tell who was a nationalist, who was a communist, who was a guerrilla or a pirate. And he said, we just had to throw ourselves at their mercy, whoever we met. One of the reasons I really enjoyed writing this chapter about them walking out of China was David Thatcher, who walked out with Don's crew. He was on a different plane, but he walked out with Don's crew. And he described it so well. Well, Don Smith had food that he liked. Everybody that they met along the route wanted to give them eggs, and they wanted to give them chickens. So they had that food. However, one thing that the Chinese people at that time thought was strange was that the men wanted to find a way to cook the chicken rather than eating it raw. They would eat the eggs raw, but not the chicken. And finally, they did devise some ways of building fires and cooking chicken. David Thatcher, when I interviewed him, said, well, you looked at Don's life. He was a really good basketball player. Did he play in college? And I said, well, I really studied his athletic record because it was important to him. And I said, no, there's no evidence he played high school basketball at Belfouche, nor at South Dakota State. And David said, well, he was a really, really good basketball player. And here's how I know. We were 5 Americans walking across China. Every Chinese teenager that we saw, and some adult men, 5 Americans, they've got to be a basketball team. we want to play an American basketball team. And it was a big deal. He said we would come into these villages. They all had baskets set up somewhere. And our feet were tired. We were tired, but they were our hosts. So we never turned down an invitation to play basketball. And I later learned that Don played basketball in an intramural league after his last football season was done. He was always afraid of spraining or breaking an ankle when he was part of a football team. And so only for like 3 months after the 1939 football season did he learn basketball, and was good enough to really, really impress David Thatcher and everybody he met in China. Lots of adventures getting across China, but they made it. Got to Chongqing. Took them about 3.5 weeks. And Tom Griffin said, you know, we walked most of the time. We got rides on trucks sometimes, once on a train. We even rode horses one time, but we got to our destination. And when he had delivered his men safely, June 1942, Don had one thing in mind. He wanted to get back to Belle Fourche in time for the 1942 4th of July Roundup Rodeo. And there he is. You can see he succeeded in doing that. He got quite an ovation because by the time he got to Belle Fourche, the word was out. All the pilots had been featured in Life magazine. Everybody knew who Don was. And there he is, looking pretty pleased to be home, less than 3 months after bombing Kobe, Japan. The other thing he had on his mind when this photo was taken is, boy, as soon as this rodeo is over, I'm getting on a bus and I'm going down to San Antonio to see Marie because it's time for our baby to be born. And indeed, he did that. I want to show you one more photo before we go to San Antonio. There he is, 4th of July rodeo. He's sitting there with his aviator glasses. That's his mom. To our left, his dad, Doc Smith. To his right, to our right. And I don't know who the young woman is behind them, not part of their party apparently. But he got to the rodeo, and it's a sad photo for me to look at because within 4 months, 5 months, I guess, Don would be dead, his dad would be dead. So it was the last family photo. He went to San Antonio, missed the baby's birth by 1 day, and then he was off training again. He had a new mission that was learning to fly and to teach new pilots to fly the B-26. He knew that he was going to take the B-26 to Africa, and he was going to be part of the invasion of Italy from the south across the Mediterranean from Africa. You can read his letters when he flew to Europe before going to Africa. He was really homesick after spending a few weeks with his daughter in Texas. Last thing he wanted to be was over in Europe. He was frustrated, mail was slow. He was in England. The only thing I could get were day-old or 2-day-old newspapers. And to his great disappointment, the Yankees lost the World Series that year. And so not a good time in England in 1942. Finally, they were about ready to fly to Africa. And he was in a crash that killed him in southern England, actually not too far outside of London, and killed instantly. His dad got the news back in Belfouche, and within a matter of days had a stroke that paralyzed him, and he was never able to walk again. And then his dad died Christmas Eve, 1942. So sad ending for a really heroic young man and his family. A couple other South Dakotans who were part of the Doolittle Raid in one way or another. Well, they're not South Dakotans, but they, in all cases, but they had South Dakota connections. One was General Hap Arnold in the Army. His first mission involving airplanes was in 1927. He commanded the project that flew mail from Washington, D.C. to Custer State Park for President Calvin Coolidge. And that was a whole different airplane. They had some incredible weather adventures, but as he always said, we got the mail delivered to President Roosevelt. After the war, Hap Arnold was awarded an honorary doctorate from the South Dakota School of Mines. Also, I'm sure as historians, many of you know Robert Casey, the writer from Beersford, South Dakota. Went on to write for the Chicago News, and he wrote a ton of books, including many about his home state. Maybe his best known was The Black Hills and Their Incredible Characters. That was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. And so I was amazed that he showed up in this story. He was on a ship, he was embedded with the Navy on a ship that was accompanying the Hornet, and he actually witnessed that famous takeoff. And in a matter of hours, figured out what he thought was probably happening, because it was not public information to the press or anybody else. So next time you pick up a book by Mr. Casey, and I recommend all of them, he actually witnessed the Doolittle Raid takeoff. I think I'd like to open it to questions at this point.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. What amazing stories. So we have a note here, a fan note from Curtis Loesch, and he just finished reading your Tom Berry bio. So,
oh, thank you for doing that.
and he found it very interesting. All right.
Thank you.
So while people, if you all have questions, please put them in the chat, and I will relay them to Paul. But in the meantime, my normal question is, well, actually I have two, but first, how did you get started with Don Smith and the Doolittle Raid? What led you to do this research and write the book?
I can thank the Belfouche Chamber of Commerce. I didn't know anything about Don Smith. They invited me to come up there in 2001. They were going to start a little museum display about Don Smith in the Tri-State Museum. And they were also going to make the day one to honor Don Smith. So I drove up there knowing nothing about Don Smith, not knowing as much as I should about the Doolittle Raid, and as a matter of fact, and I just was fascinated by the story. By coincidence, that was the day I met David Thatcher, the guy who played basketball with Don across China. And David was, he had heard about this day to honor Don Smith, and he wanted to come, and he and his wife came, and I was seated right next to him when we got to talking. And unfortunately, I didn't have any questions ready for him because I didn't know enough about the raid. But I made his acquaintance, very nice gentleman, and then we talked many times by telephone.
Wow, it's serendipitous sometimes how these topics just kind of end in our laps, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then you just go with it. All right. Oh, so Curtis is commenting, in Huron's Jefferson fourth grade in about 1967, he read a book about the Doolittle raid that remains in his memory and imagination. It would have been much more impressionable had he known one of those Doolittle Raider heroes was from a town nearby. So his teacher, Mrs. Woolman, must not have known, right? She didn't tell them of Don presenting him as a local hero, teaching us to respect and emulate those who sacrifice for the country. I wonder how much larger that impression may have been. Thanks for the story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that connection, right, with somebody who's nearby. And I think for South Dakotans, just having that,
It was
knowing
kind of
about that
strange how
heroism.
much he was forgotten, and in fact, Henry Potter was forgotten. So yeah, he had Doolittle Raiders that came from Belle Fourche and from Pierre, very close to where he was. Uh, some of you maybe know Jimmy Doolittle organized a reunion every year in April for his Flyers, and they decided to come to the new Civic Center in Rapid City in 1978, and they were kind of hosted by both the city of Rapid City and Ellsworth Air Force Base. And that's kind of when a lot of people rediscovered who Don Smith was. His widow actually came up for that reunion too. It was the only one she ever went to. And a lot of coverage in the Rapid City Journal, 1978. But then when I started writing about him in 2001, 2002, he was really forgotten again. As for Hank Potter, the other raider, Doolittle's navigator, he had a long Air Force career, but all of it out of state, mostly in Texas. So he was kind of lost to South Dakotans as well.
So when you jumped into this research, what did you find that really, really surprised you?
I was surprised that, frankly, the Army and Navy would actually try this, because there was nothing that said they were going to have success. And then everything that could go wrong that day did go wrong. Taking off early, the rubber raft being deflated. But remarkably, there were 3 men who died bailing out of their planes. 8 others were captured by the Japanese, and 3 of them were executed by firing squad. But more than 64, I guess, survived. And nobody ever would have guessed that they'd have that many survivors.
We have one last question here. What happened to Don's widow and daughter?
I really wanted to interview them for the book, and I got contact for them. But then all of a sudden, Marie was really, really sick. This was 2004, maybe, when I decided to write the book. And she died. And strangely, like just a month before she died, the daughter died too.
Wow.
And so I was just like, oh no, I was too late. And because it was a small family, who am I going to get to talk to? Turned out there was a woman, Don's cousin, Ruth, who actually didn't live much longer, but I got to interview her. I think it was 2008, 2009. She wondered if I could help get Don inducted into the Aviation Hall of Fame, and we were able to do that. And but thank goodness for Ruth. She had such vivid memories of Don growing up. She really defined what kind of a character he had, and then that was confirmed by every raider I talked to. Just decent, respectful, never wanted to call attention to himself.
Such a great
When
story.
I researched his athletic record, I don't think he ever talked to a sports writer at South Dakota State, or even the school paper at Belle Fourche. He just didn't want to do that. He was very reticent. He did, however, in Brookings and in Belfouche, that few weeks he was back, or few days he was back in 1942, he did do talks to groups in those communities. That's where he came up with the crack. If that was a hospital, it was the first one ever that had airplanes coming out of it.
Well, he sounds like truly an American hero.
Yeah. Yep. Very definitely.
Thank you so much for sharing this story with us. And I know if you haven't read The First Strike, I bet you are just itching to do that now. So, and we are out of time. I just want to thank Paul again for sharing his evening with us and this amazing story.